Isaac Asimov. What can I say about this fantastic author? If you're not familiar with Isaac Asimov, he is one of the top 2 or 3 most respected, most acclaimed science fiction authors since the inception of science fiction, to be absolutely clear. Today I want to review the book that I just finished reading, and that is The Gods Themselves, Isaac Asimov. And let me tell you, this book really took me back to a time in my journey with science fiction and reading literature in general where I was really invested in the science, in the concepts, and this book particularly falls under the guise of what I like to call hard science fiction or high concept science fiction. The idea being that the science is the main brunt of the story. The author is exploring scientific concepts, usually with a pretty high degree of plausibility. In other words, the science actually could happen, or at least it seems that way, the way it's written. It's a vision of the future that's created, and so many things that we have today have been inspired by those science fiction takes that we got from the 60s and the 70s. Things like Star Trek, for example, started out fairly high concept, even though it was a bit of an adventure. But the difference between standard run-of-the-mill science fiction and high concept science fiction is really the plausibility of the science and the dedication of the plot to proving the science. So with this book, The Gods Themselves, it was actually a series of 3 novellas or short stories which were originally published in science fiction magazines. That was really where a lot of the best stories actually happened back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. The pulp science fiction magazines were really where some of the greatest stories of all time were ever written by the greats like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov. And this particular book, The Gods Themselves, absolutely stands the test of time. I would absolutely completely recommend this book, and I would definitely recommend this as an audiobook. The audiobook version was read and performed by Scott Brick, who is an absolute favorite of mine. Scott Brick is an absolute legend when it comes to audiobooks in terms of putting not only great voices and great emotion, but for some reason he has like a timing about him where he's able to perform all of these different characters in such a way that you feel like you're watching or listening to something cinematic. It's not just somebody reading a book, it's someone performing a book. He's just an absolute master. So the experience with the audiobook for Isaac Asimov's The Gods Themselves with Scott Brick reading is absolutely a joy. You will feel like you've learned something. You will feel like you have grown in here where it matters. This is really the hallmark of great science fiction, is if it makes you feel like you have grown, like you have learned something, like you have come to a new realization about yourself or the world around you. That is what science fiction is meant to do, and this book absolutely does this. I give Isaac Asimov's The Gods Themselves an 8.5 out of 10. Rated against his other works, it's excellent, but not the best. I still think Asimov's Foundation series, particularly the first book, Foundation, is his best work, but he's also responsible for, you may have seen the movie I, Robot with Will Smith. He's responsible for the original story behind that movie. So many other things that you would recognize. And I give this book, as I say, an 8.5 out of 10. Probably would have been a little bit higher, except I have read so much of his stuff, and I know that he is capable of even better. So what you have is a part 1, a part 2, and a part 3. And as you're reading the book, you really have to think. You really have to pay attention. It's not one of these books that you can just kind of breeze through. The way the author has put the book together, you basically have 3 separate stories which tie into each other. I am going to move into the spoiler territory here as we move on, so if that's something that bothers you, by all means click away from the video. Just know that I thought the book was fantastic. Definitely worth the read if you want something that's going to make you think and inspire you to think harder and deeper on subjects like the multiverse and the future of humanity and the nature of humanity, whether we're really ugly or beautiful on the inside. All of these concepts get addressed in this book. But to move into the spoiler territory, which, look guys, this book is 40, 50 years old. It was written in the early 70s. So if you haven't read it by now, all bets are off. So I'm going to try to avoid really nasty spoilers, but I do have to kind of uncover some of the surprises in the book just to give you an idea of what makes this book so great. So part 1 starts off on Earth, pretty contemporary to our time. You're looking at a group of scientists, and you're looking at the human condition of rivalry and competition between scientists, and you have one guy who's particularly unlikable, and he ends up stumbling on something that makes him into basically a hero in the scientific community. He unknowingly makes contact with a parallel universe, or rather the parallel universe makes contact with him, but nobody was really able to prove that. And the way the author moves into this story just kind of assumes that you understand the backstory and dribbles stuff out bit by bit to you through dialogue and through really interesting scientific commentary. But the idea here is that humanity is in a search for a better power source. Fossil fuels are running towards the end of their course, and people are starting to worry about the future of energy. Of course, they've got nuclear, but even with nuclear, there's dangers and limitations to that. They're looking for the ultimate holy grail, to produce clean, free, limitless energy. And this particular scientist, who was not very well liked and not very well respected, seemed to have tripped across something just by accident that gave the building blocks for that free energy. Now you move into the second part of the book, and this is really what starts to make you think. Asimov does an amazing job. Let me just digress here for a second. So many science fiction worlds that are built, whether they're looking at you, Star Trek, with the only difference between aliens is the ridges on their foreheads and maybe the color of the makeup. Asimov builds an amazing world, the likes of which you have never seen before or since, really. The alien culture that he builds to be in this parallel universe, the ones that sent the information to this scientist so that he discovers the free energy, well, this culture is amazing, and the author dives into all of the different aspects of their culture without a single moment of exposition. He doesn't take even 2 minutes or 2 paragraphs to explain where you are, what the world looks like, what the people look like, nothing like that. He dives right into a conversation between a couple of these aliens, or paramen as they call them, from the parallel universe, and he spends like a third of the book just living in their shoes, explaining the story from their point of view, from the point of view of one particular family. But the really interesting thing is how he builds this family dynamic. He explores the issue of discrimination. He explores the issues of sexuality. In this particular culture, there are 2 dominant races. There are the hard ones and the soft ones. And the soft ones seem to be energy beings of some kind. And they live in what's called a triad, which is a marital/sexual combination of 3 units, where you have one which is a logical, one which is a parental, and one which is an emotional. And the 3 of them have to work together to reproduce and to grow as individuals. I'm not going to give away the big spoiler of that storyline, but let's suffice it to say, Asimov's descriptions of everything down to the minute details of sexual interactions between these fictional races is just absolutely mind-blowing, that you don't think of things. And especially, this was written in 1972, and there are so many things that would resonate today with, for example, the transgender community. Unbelievable storytelling on Asimov's part to build up these race of people and make them relatable, even though they're so much different from us. So there's a conclusion to that third part of the story. As I said, these were released as 3 novellas. Now, I think there was some editing done to kind of bring them together into a cohesive story, but you go from the part 1, which really stands on its own, to part 2, which is in a completely different universe, and then you go to part 3, which brings you back in the general timeline of part 1, maybe 15 or 20 years later sort of thing, and you're following another scientist who is trying to prove that the free energy that the first scientist created is very dangerous and is going to destroy the world. Absolutely, you've really got to pay attention to the science, because the way that the physics are actually explained in the book seems so plausible, so interesting, and I never for 1 minute felt like I was reading fiction. It's presented in such a way that this could absolutely be fact, and I think that is often overlooked with the older classic science fiction authors, the fact that the science is so well thought out, and often the authors collaborate with real physicists, real rocket scientists, and things like that to come up with some of the really gripping science to make the science fiction seem more legitimate. But in part 3, we're dealing with this second scientist who essentially wants to disprove the first scientist, but he knows that the first scientist has so much societal and political legitimacy that he's never going to be able to knock him off his throne unless he can create an alternative to replace the free energy that the first guy did. So there's a huge amount. Now, this takes place on the moon in part 3, and some of the descriptions of what life would be like on the moon, with the differences in gravity and the differences in lifestyle, the differences in food, even the differences in sex. Again, sex is definitely mentioned several times in all 3 parts of this book, but in a very interesting and respectful way. It's not at all bawdy or anything like that. But what ends up happening is the second scientist is able to tie all 3 of these parts, all 3 of these books together into a conclusion where we've got a future where humanity is finally kind of moved to the next level. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of the dirty underbelly of society, which is still showing through a couple hundred years in the future, obviously. But absolutely, I would completely recommend this book. So anyways, guys, thanks for sticking around for this video. Book reviews are something that I really care about, especially audiobook reviews. I want to let people know some of the great experiences that I've had and what I think about these books. Science fiction is a huge passion of mine, as is fantasy. So you can definitely expect more reviews like this in the future. Anyways, guys, thanks for sticking around. Hit the like button if you would. It absolutely helps out a ton. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Stay classy.